So when did you hear that about the Extinction Rebellion people?
It was on the ABC website this afternoon.
Suburban Eastern Australia, an environment that has, over time, evolved some extraordinarily unique groups of Homo sapiens. But today, we observe a small tribe akin to a group of meerkats that gather together atop a small mound to watch, question, and discuss the current events of their city, their country, and their world at large. Let's listen keenly and observe this group fondly known as the Iron Fist and the Velvet Glove.
Yes, welcome, dear listener. Welcome, everyone in the on the broadcast who are watching. This is the Iron Fist Velvet Glove podcast, episode 223. I'm Trevor, the Iron Fist. As always, with me, Scott, the Velvet Glove.
G'day Trevor, g'day Paul, g'day listeners.
And Paul, the 12th man.
G'day Trevor, g'day Scott, g'day listeners.
We've had a busy week of things happening. This is a podcast. If you're tuning in for the first time, we talk about news and politics, sex and religion, particularly focusing on Australia, but we'll also look at world events when appropriate. And tonight we're going to kick off with a bit of a look at the great debate between Fiona Patten and Martin Iles of the ACL, which was at the Press Club. And I watched that, so I've got some thoughts about that. And then last week, 12th Man, we were talking about renewable energy and whether it was possible to replace coal fire with renewable energy, and got quite a big sort of list of things to get through with all those concepts. Mm-hmm. And after that, maybe a little bit of Donald Trump threatening the world and up to all sorts of mischief. I mean, normally the sorts of things that Donald Trump has been saying, if any other president said it at any other time, we would have created a special episode. We would have gone to where, oh my God, the president's gone nuts. Can you believe what's happening? But alas, it's just yet another outrageous statement and par for the course.
Exactly. You just got to, it's par for the course.
Yeah, it's quite frightening. So hello, Will. Hello, Alison in the chat room. So, well, the debate. So this was at the National Press Club. Fiona Patten, leader of the Reason Party, formerly Sex Party, she was debating Martin Iles of the ACL about the religious discrimination bill. So I sat down and watched it. I missed probably, I suspect, the first 2 or 3 minutes, which would have been sort of Martin Iles' introduction. And the stream that came through kind of cut off right on the 1 hour mark. So I'm not sure how much was said afterwards. So there might have been 2 minutes at the beginning and I don't know how much at the end that I might have missed. But anyway.
I found that too.
Yeah.
Just died right at the hour mark, and they were still going with it, but they got cut off.
So, Scott, you saw it? What did you think?
I did watch it.
Without being contaminated by the thoughts I've already expressed.
It wasn't a complete disaster.
Right.
But I do think that I was disappointed in Fiona Patten's attack of the whole thing. I was expecting, I suppose, for her to be a little more forthright. And I really thought that if anyone was going to have Martin Iles on his ass, it would have been her. But she didn't. It was almost like she was being too polite, I felt. Now, I don't know whether or not that's me just being too critical of her, or whether I was just thinking to myself, I really want to see this bastard go down, because I do want to see that bastard go down. There is no doubt about that. But it wasn't a complete disaster, but it wasn't, I don't think it was her best performance ever. That's probably the fairest way I could put it.
We should have sent Trevor.
Well,
that's what I said.
That was probably a fair assessment. I'll probably be a little bit harsher.
Yeah, I know you're going to be harsher.
Yeah, I'd be interested, Alison, if you watched it, whether you thought, or in the chat room, score out of 10 or your thoughts on how it went. But for me, Martin Iles is a very polished performer. He is obviously used to standing up and giving his spiel on the topic of religious freedom, and I think he's done it a lot more. I mean, Fiona's a serving politician with a lot of things on the plate, with a lot of things happening, and it was clear that he was across the brief in detail more than she was. And the other thing was that this was a debate which degenerated into legal interpretations of the Religious Discrimination Act and what would be caught and what wouldn't and when. And he's a lawyer. Like,
Yep.
and so he was clearly, as another lawyer watching it, running rings around her when it came to describing how the sections worked and being able to say, well, what you've just said makes no sense because what you've talked about is something that's occurring in work, whereas the section we're talking about is about stuff occurring outside of work and things like this. And I don't think Fiona had a full grasp of the entire bill, and her focus was, and the focus of the whole debate was about that section 41, which was the section that talked about saying statements of belief and how that would be get a green light, and you wouldn't be like there was that guy Porteous in Tasmania who was hauled before the courts for making statements about marriage
equality.
yeah. And anti-discrimination acts were sort of raised to try and prevent him from saying stuff. And Section 41 is basically saying if you make a statement of a religious belief, you can't be held accountable under a religious discrimination act in the States. That's what the whole goddamn debate seemed to me to be about, was about Section 41 and about freedom of speech issues. And when we've talked about that bill, the least offensive part to us is the freedom of speech things, because the three of us are kind of like, well, we're happy for people to say almost anything, provided you're not inciting violence. So it's one of the sections of the Act that I don't really... doesn't worry me too much. And that was what the debate degenerated into, was about the freedom of speech and the whole issue of employment and the ability and the sort of the way that religious folk are advantaged compared to secular people really wasn't explored properly. And I really don't think Fiona gave enough simple examples of, a person in this situation could be sacked. You're a volunteer working at Red Shield op shop and you could be sacked. Or other really concrete examples where people would go, that's just clearly unfair. We don't want that happening. She just got tied up in the legalese of it, I thought. So, so what are you handing me there, Scott?
It's just the chat room. Has it died?
No, it's still going. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, at the 30-minute mark, I was writing in my notes, still talking about freedom of speech. At the 47-minute mark, I wrote, still talking about freedom of speech. 60-minute mark, the whole damn thing was about freedom of speech in Section 41. So, So I felt that she didn't really lay a glove on him, and anybody watching that debate would come out of it going, well, she said this, he said that.
Yeah.
Probably somewhere in the middle's fair. Yeah. Nothing too nasty in this that we have to necessarily worry about. So,
so it's a bit of a wasted opportunity for secularists.
I think so. But to the National Secular Lobby's credit, I mean, they got to a venue like that and got to have a say. And while it mightn't have been perfect, at least they were there and had a chance to give the other point of view.
Maybe we need some legally trained ambassadors.
Yeah, but like Luke Beck was in that program, God Forbid, and really he was soft on.
Yeah, he wasn't as strong
on it as well. Like he was saying,
arguer either.
Yeah, so
what's his background? It's philosophy.
He's a constitutional lawyer.
Oh, is he?
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's difficult for the National Secular Lobby because they need ambassadors of some sort of fame, if you like, or celebrity status, and but then those ambassadors may not embrace fully how much we would like anyway, the sort of secular ideal. So you sort of you need them because you wouldn't get a gig like that otherwise. But then you don't really control so much of what they're going to say. So it's a price you have to pay. So hopefully they can parlay this into some future things where, other debates where perhaps the president of the National Secular Lobby will be deemed sufficient celebrity, have sufficient celebrity status to appear, and he can be more forthright and
they have 2 or 3 celebrity ambassadors. Of course, Philip Adams, although I don't get the feeling he's all that active, is he? And Jane Carrow, she's pretty well known.
Yeah. And they've got their special interests. So, Jane's more about education and private schools sort of thing.
Yeah.
So
she's strong on public schooling, and
Yes.
I give her full credit for that.
Yeah.
And who's the other legal eagle from Melbourne who was running for the Greens? Isn't he he's not an ambassador, is he?
I don't know.
Julian Burnside.
Yeah. Is he associated with National Secular Lobby?
Thought he was.
I thought he was
Not
too.
sure. But in any event, with this particular debate, it got down to such legal arguments that they would have been better off with Luke Beck, perhaps, as a constitutional lawyer who would have been across the detail of that a bit more. So, I don't,
So a bit of a lost opportunity.
Yeah.
Should we ask for a rematch?
Yeah. Indeed. Yeah. So anyway, that was that. It was a bit of a letdown, I think. But
Never
anyway,
mind.
if you're out there and you get a chance to watch it, let me know if you think I'm crazy in my assessment or not. So, but I really would have liked some more philosophical discussion about, my hobby horse of, hey, it's just an ideology. You're nothing special. Why should you be given anything at all? You can just make up your own doctrine, which is then protected. So
It's
there was
not
none
just
of that.
an ideology, it's a ludicrous ideology based on fairy tales.
Yeah, no,
none
but
of that.
that was raised by Fiona initially. She did raise it, but not very loudly or anything like that. And I thought to myself, geez, maybe she is going to get him. But then she didn't say anything about it again. And that's the whole point. She said that you are setting yourselves up to be above the rest of us, which is what they are doing.
That's what they feel they are.
Absolutely. And I just thought if she'd hit that harder, then she would have landed a body blow on him.
Plus, there's this whole concept where Martin Iles believes that religious institutions have a religious ethos and that they should be able to conduct their institution according to their religious ethos. And you really need to say, look, that's relevant when we're talking about the appointment of priests and maybe of the religious instruction teacher, but not the gardener and not the math teacher. It has to be relevant to it and to enunciate why that's unfair and the fact that they employ so many people in teaching. And he was basically saying, well, when you sign up for a gig with a Christian institution, you are given a list of, ethical requirements and you either accept them or reject them, and you are told up front what you're going to be compelled to do. And of course I would say, well, that's just irrelevant to jobs that don't have a religious element to them. But also then they were talking about Falau, and it was the ideal opportunity to say, well, hang on, you don't think that when it comes to Falau, because he was given a contract which says you're allowed to do this and this and this, and he decided not to, and we want to sack him, and you're saying you can't do that because he needs to be able to uphold his faith. So he was quite hypocritical with that, and of course none of that came out. So, yeah. So anyway, that was the debate. Bit of a fizzer as far as I'm concerned. I think the ACL would be very happy with how it panned out. Yeah.
I would have thought so.
So Martin Iles has a legal background, does he?
Yes, he does. Yeah.
I wonder
and he was very good. Very good. I have to say, he was so confident, so assured, on top of his brief.
He wasn't at that meeting we went to some time back, was he?
No. Lyle Shelton's been at a few.
Lyle Shelton was there, but there was another chap that spoke quite articulately at that meeting as well, I recall, but I don't know who he was.
Right. So he did a lot better job than, say, Lyle Shelton would have done, I believe. So
okay.
Absolutely.
He's a dangerous foe. Is Martin
dangerous
Iles.
foe because
Indeed.
he's incredibly intelligent. He's certainly very well spoken, and he
Yeah.
presents exceptionally well.
And doesn't it surprise you when you come across someone who really is smart and yet they believe this ludicrous nonsense?
Yes. It is, yeah.
I'm always amazed by it. I can understand stupid people believing it, and there are enough of them in the world. But when you come across really sharp-minded people, and they have every opportunity to investigate the veracity of these fairy tales, and they don't want to go near them.
But we've said this in the past with tribalism,
Yeah.
that the smarter you are, the better your rationalisations for agreeing
For
to
anything.
the tribal position.
Yes.
So you actually get really clever at adopting your argument to match in with the tribal argument.
So that's right.
Yeah. So that's that. I actually since last time we spoke, Dean Stretton, remember Dean, who wrote a submission to
Yeah, yeah.
the Ruddock inquiry?
From Sydney.
Yes.
He's a lawyer, isn't he?
Yes,
Yeah,
barrister.
he wrote an extremely good submission, didn't he?
So he's written a submission on this religious discrimination bill, and there's a link to it on the website. If you look at the blog posts by visiting contributors, you'll see a link to it there, a PDF. So great submission by Dean, and just one part of it was where we're talking about the way that people, the religious people, are able to make a religious belief and it's not discrimination. And they can talk about anything at all that is pertaining to religious doctrine. But when it comes to a non-religious person, the only thing they can say is something about religion, which will be sort of protected by the Act. So whereas religious people have an open field to talk about any topic under the sun that vaguely falls within their doctrinal beliefs, so typically Christians could talk about, gay marriage or, even climate change potentially, I don't know. With secular people, you're really limited to commenting on religious issues and being exempt from the Act. And he was saying really, you could have, for example, the following beliefs. 1, abortion is morally wrong. 2, voluntary euthanasia is morally wrong. 3, there are only 2 genders and a person cannot change their gender simply by identifying as a different gender. 4, marriage should only be between a man and a woman. 5, killing animals for food is morally permissible. So he said if you hold one of those beliefs on religious grounds, you'd be protected from discrimination under the bill. But it's entirely possible that you could hold one of those beliefs just as a philosophical ground, nothing to do with religion, but you wouldn't be protected under the Act. And that was one of his arguments for saying how it's just treating religious people differently to secular people.
He argued that.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, and he's saying that's wrong to give a special benefit to religious people.
He said that.
This is Dean Stretton. He's
Dean Stretton. Sorry, I was thinking of Martin Iles again.
So he's on our side. Dean's on our side.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
No, I agree with Dean.
Okay, good.
No, I was just, I don't know why, but my mind went back to Martin Iles and I thought, he's arguing against his own case now.
No, there we go. Okay.
Sorry.
Right. Now, last week, we talked about climate change briefly. And we were discussing about renewables and briefly whether it was possible to have a fully renewable system. So I've done some...
Economically possible,
yes,
of course.
I've done some research,
Good for you.
and you haven't had the chance to fully research, but I'm going to give you the sort of nuts and bolts of my understanding so far, and then if you come up with something different later on, you can always chime in a future episode and disagree.
It will have to be a future episode, unfortunately.
Or somebody out there listening might choose to. So, okay. First of all, the way this came up was because we were talking about the poll, which was, I think, in Essential, which said asking Australians whether they think climate change is real or not. And the choices were climate change is happening and is caused by human activity, which was 63% of people, or we are just witnessing a normal fluctuation in the Earth's climate, which was 25%, and the don't knows were 13%. And one of our listeners, got outraged. And he said, that's just a false dichotomy. And I didn't really know what he was talking about at first. And he said, well, it should have had the answers of both or neither. So because I think he might have taken the view that, well, it could be a bit of both, that climate change is caused by human activity and it's because of normal fluctuations in the Earth's
I agree
climate.
with Walsh that
it could be quite right. So.
It's often a mistake to divide things into an either-or
so he wasn't happy with the false dichotomy there. But anyway,
Good
that was what the poll was about. 63% believe it's happening because of human activity, given the limited choices they had on the form. Right. Question is, do we as Australians care? And the ABC has been conducting a poll about various issues of Australians and whether they care or not. So I'm going to switch the screen just so that people watching on the live stream can see some of this. So I think they've about 50,000 people have logged in to the ABC survey.
I only just found out about it today. I've got to go and do it.
Yeah,
You're one of them.
I did it a couple of days ago.
Does it take long?
No, not really. 10 minutes, I don't know.
And having done it, then they tell you the statistics. I haven't done it, but did a screenshot for me of some of the results. So they asked people, or one of the answers was the proportion of people who said that certain problems were affecting them personally. And the biggest one was climate change, 72%, saving enough for retirement, 62%, your health or the health of a family member, 56%, and affording a home was 46%. So a bunch of other ones, job security, crime, providing for family. Bunch of issues, but the clear leader in that was 72% climate change. So that's a very strong sort of indication where people are saying it's affecting them personally.
Are you surprised by that figure?
It's a weird question how it's put. You know,
Affecting
which of these
you
problems are affecting you personally, or are going to affect you personally, or anyway, I guess it's just saying people read a question, but would probably go, "What's important to you? What are you worried about the most?" It's probably, "What are you worried about the most?" would be how people would paraphrase the question, and it seemed like climate change was the top one.
And that's
Fair enough.
Yeah, that would be my fair enough answer to that. Is that what's worrying you the most? The 72%. That would make sense.
Yeah.
But I didn't agree with the whole thing that it's going to affect me personally.
Yeah, but I think people would read it as being, well, what's important to you? So, okay, that's 70. That's from ABC. So
I'm not sure, but there were, I don't recall the exact wording, but I'm pretty sure there were other questions that were related to your personal state, like mental state, emotional state, things like that. They did ask questions about loneliness, about how often you have sex, things like that.
there were 27 worry factors. So out of those, the top one was climate change.
Okay.
As a worry factor. There we go. What are you worried about? Climate change. Then they asked people, from what you know about climate change, which of the following statements comes closest to your opinion? Climate change has been established as a serious problem and immediate action is necessary. 52% of men agree, 68% of women agree. And next one down, there is enough evidence that climate change is taking place and some action should be taken. That was 21% of women and 26% of men. So take those two together and you've got 89% women and 78% of men say that climate change has been established as a serious problem and immediate action is necessary, or at least there's enough evidence that it's taking place that some action should be taken. So that's a big majority of people who think that.
What do you think about the gap between men and women at that top one? Climate change has been established as a serious problem. Immediate action is necessary. 52% men, 68% women. That seems to me a significant gap, isn't it?
It is. And in the ones where people said, well, concern about climate change is unwarranted, men were 10%, women 5%. So
Yeah.
people who think about climate change as being unwarranted are more likely to be men, to be white Australians, to be older and to live in regional or rural parts of the country, according to the survey.
Interesting.
Pauline Hanson supported by the...
No, I
To
was
some
just
extent.
thinking. I was just thinking my brother-in-law. That's all.
Right. Yep.
You know.
Does he fit that, does he?
Well, he's an older bloke. He's
Well, I fit that, but I'm not a Pauline Hanson supporter.
No, I know that.
No, but you don't
You
think
didn't
that
live in the
concern
city
about
that-
climate change is unwarranted.
No, I don't.
You
but
think it's
I
one of the
fit,
first two. You think...
I fit the other parts of the
Yeah,
profile.
you're probably in the category that says there's enough evidence that climate change is taking place and some action should be taken.
Absolutely.
I put you in there. Yeah, you're an enlightened white old man. Here's the interesting one though. How much would you personally be willing to spend each year to help prevent climate change? And the possible answers were nothing, less than 100, between 100 and 500, between 500 and 1,000, between 1,000 and 2,000, or more than 2,000, and I don't know. So when we had close to 80% of people saying it's real, it's a genuine thing, we've got to do something about it, then they're asked how much do they want to spend, and and only 9% of people would want to spend more than $1,000 a year on it.
It's not a lot, is it?
That's pretty terrible, isn't it? And 21% less than would be nothing at all, and 18% less than $100 a year. Seriously.
I'd spend $100 on it.
Yeah. But when people say action should be taken, but then in the same survey, you've got 40% who are only willing to spend a maximum of $100, it's just bullshit. Like, seriously. That's how you really test how much people... When you test people's hip pocket is when you find out...
They should have added to the question, how much would you be willing to spend if it was a tax deduction?
Right.
I reckon they would have got a significantly different number, wouldn't you?
I don't know.
If it were a tax deduction, surely.
Well, you still pay for it. Like, you still lose money from
but you
tax
get
deduction.
get some of it back in your tax return.
You end up.
How much do you get back usually for a deduction?
Well, it depends on where your income is.
Level. Yeah, if you're on the top marginal rate,
right,
you get
45% back.
that's just sort of a 50% discount on it.
But if you're like most people that are paying up to 30% tax, then they only get 30% of it back.
Oh, is that all?
Yeah.
So the more tax you pay, the more you get back in your deductions.
Well, the more your deductions
percentage.
become worth.
Yeah.
I had no idea. I thought it was the same for everybody.
No, it's not
Right.
the same for everyone. It depends on you. It depends on
The
your
higher
income
your
level.
tax bracket, the more...
I was born in the wrong economic class.
Right. So that's a good background on do we care? Well, we say we do. Do we really care?
No, I don't think we do.
We don't.
I
If you're not prepared to spend more than $100 a year, 40% of people not even prepared to do that, you don't care. You're bullshitting.
and that is the whole point. You know, you just got to look at the fact that Tony Abbott was able to destroy Julia Gillard's carbon tax, and he destroyed it, he did it by appealing to the hip pocket nerds.
You did, yeah.
And he was able to destroy it. He destroyed it very effectively. Now, the carbon tax was quite modest, you know.
Yeah, and it might have made some kind of difference if it had continued right up until the present day.
Absolutely, it would have done.
And people like Malcolm Turnbull, he probably would have embraced it, I dare say, even if he'd...
Well, he wanted to support it, and he did support the CPRS. He crossed the floor and voted with the government on that, which is when Rudd was still Prime Minister. And he argued strongly for it, and he didn't get anywhere. But anyway.
Dear listener, we're just heading into territory where I'm just going to quickly talk about, is there really a climate emergency? What is the cost of renewables? And can we have 100% renewables? That's where we're heading. So bear with me as we head down this journey together, hand in hand. Anyone in the chat room actually alive? I know Will and Alison said hello, and there looks like about 11 people watching, but I'm just worried whether the chat room's actually functioning. So just say something so that I know it's actually working, because I'm starting to think
You might have worried them all to death with all these statistics.
Okay. So I've got a link to some articles here. All the stuff I'm talking about, of course, is in the show notes. And this particular one I've just plucked out of some Google search I did was from a guy called Paul Gilding, who is a fellow at the University of Cambridge Institute for Sustainable Leadership. And he says that scientists warn that even if all of the Paris emissions commitments are met, temperatures will surpass 1.5% warming and then increase by 3 to 5% by 2100. With additional warming beyond. So the last time the world was that hot, which is 4% warmer, was 15 million years ago during the Miocene period. So it's a while since it's been that hot. So if that happens, which is what the scientists are saying, seas could rise by more than 2 metres this century. Between 2/3 and all of the glaciers that feed Asia and South America's most important rivers will likely disappear. We could see tropical regions in Asia, Africa, Australia and the Americas become largely uninhabitable for much of the year. and a large proportion of humanity, estimated at 2 billion refugees, will need to relocate. So just parts of the world will become intolerable.
So that's under the worst case scenario, is it?
No.
Okay.
So there's lots of unknowns. So we can't say whether that's going to happen. The question is whether there is a reasonable likelihood of such an outcome. And human beings tend to err on assuming the more positive outcomes that we hope for. And so it's unknown exactly, and it could go in either direction. So it could be better than that, or it could be worse again. We just don't know. So this guy was saying that as a matter of risk management and giving the risk that we face and the probabilities, you just have to see that as a high likelihood and plan for it.
The so-called cautionary principle.
Indeed. So that's a short synopsis of is there an emergency. Next question then is about renewables versus coal. And I've got a lot of stuff here initially from an ABC fact check report. And the reason for this article was because at the time they were referring to something that Malcolm Turnbull had said, where he was saying that renewables plus storage are cheaper than coal or nuclear for new power generation. And they were looking at that and saying, is that correct? So we're going to look at the cost of renewables versus coal and see what the story is. And there's a sort of complicating factor here is the amount of backup you need depends on the amount of renewables that you've got. So for most states, except South Australia, this is not an issue yet. So what they're saying is that basically until you get to 50% renewables, there's enough flexibility in the system that you don't need to worry about extra backup storage. So up to 50% renewables, you could replace coal-fired stations, coal-fired power stations with renewables up to 50%, and you don't have to worry about extra storage. That's what the statistics tell you.
Because the coal-fired power stations
At
can
50%,
supply
yes. The ups and downs will
during
be
the
catered
night
for.
When
the wind's not blowing.
when the wind's not blowing, when the sun's not shining.
We'll get to that. So up to 50% in a state, you can just keep adding your renewables up to that point and not even worry about extra storage. Okay? So energy is typically measured in megawatt hours, and a megawatt hour is roughly what 300 homes use during 1 hour.
Oh, that's
Okay?
interesting.
And comparing direct running costs can paint a misleading picture because some technologies are more expensive to build but cheaper to run. Others have lower capital costs but higher running costs. So what you need to do is use a measure called the levelized cost of electricity, where you incorporate the cost of the capital and you depreciate it throughout the lifespan of the infrastructure and then add the operating cost to that to get the levelized cost. So it's really the capital costs amortized out plus the running costs, and that accounts for the differences where you've got a lot of infrastructure up front or you don't have a lot of infrastructure up front. Clear as mud so far?
Yeah, that's
Good.
fine.
So the levelized cost of electricity. For coal, the CSIRO and the Australian Energy Market Operator, there's various figures that float around, but you can pretty safely say $96 per megawatt hour for coal. That's for black coal. Brown coal even a bit more, 107. But around the $100 mark. Keep that in mind for coal. Now, some people will give you a slightly cheaper estimate, but if you were to build a coal-fired power station, there's a risk premium that anybody lending to build a coal-fired power station is going to add about 5% risk premium because coal's on the nose and it's a lot to invest and you're not sure that you're ever going to be able to use it. So you've got to add that into any figures. So around $100 mark roughly. The levelised cost of wind and solar. Wind, $57. Solar, $53. So nearly half the cost of the coal generation. a megawatt hour of. So that's all. That's a big difference. Yep. So in terms of actual running costs, you could easily, and that's the levelised cost. That's taking into account infrastructure. So it's a no-brainer. You would have renewables.
But how many windmills would you have to build to produce the same amount of power as one coal-fired power station?
It doesn't matter because I've given you the levelised cost of a
It
megawatt hour.
It is a cost, yeah. That's
so
true,
I've told you, looking at how much a coal-fired power station can generate, the cost per megawatt, roughly 100. Windmill, cost per megawatt, half that.
I understand
So it
that.
doesn't matter. You just build enough to have enough electricity. So the point is that, and there's actually contracts now, like the state government Victoria entered into a contract with a wind farm who basically agreed to supply electricity at $50 to $60. So on a long-term renewable contract. So these are not fanciful figures. The difficulty then is about storage. And this is where we were coming to, where you were saying, well, I don't think you can have 100% renewable because what if the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow? What's going to happen? So I'm going to skip ahead to an article. Let me just see if I can get the heading of it here. Bear with me, sorry. Is 100% renewable feasible? And this was a report by these three guys, Blakers, Liu and Stocks at the Australian National University. And what they did was they looked at climate in Australia over, I think, a 3-year period for every hour of the day. How much wind was there in various pockets in Australia? How much sun was shining? And would it have been possible to construct a system that would have relied just on wind and solar and a little bit of hydro that's already existing and without any coal fire at all? And could we have created a system that would be able to have supplied power for every hour of the day during those
3 years?
Yeah. Looking at the weather patterns and temperatures and wind and whatever. And basically, how much would it cost? And they said, good news, it's possible. And the way that you do it is through pumped hydro energy storage, PHES. So pumped hydro is where you have a pond of water up in the hills and a pond of water down in the valley, and you have a pump in between them and a pipe. And basically, when you've got excessive wind and solar power, you run the pump to pump the water up to the top dam. And then during periods where the wind's not blowing and the sun ain't shining, you run the water through and generate electricity.
Yeah, through a dynamo on the way.
Turbine or whatever. So the power that you use pumping the water up to the top pond and then the power that you get back as it comes through, you get 80% return. So you're going to lose 20%. But that's not bad, like in the scheme of things. And this is a method of storage of power that's been used around the world for ages. Small fun fact. Ivanhoe Dam has got this. Did you know that?
No, I didn't until
I
I
knew that.
read your show notes.
Yeah. So Ivanhoe Dam, dear listener, in southeast Queensland, was constructed about 30 years ago for water
Flood
storage.
mitigation and
Flood
water storage.
Yeah, exactly. And they created a little split yard dam, it was called, beside it, which basically pumps water up during times of plenty of power and lets it through when we need the power. And yours truly was a construction worker class 3
Were
who
you?
worked on the split yard
Really?
little saddle dam as they were creating the little hydro dam there. So that's
Did you join a union?
I was part of the union, yes, and it was quite good money, I can tell you. And I earned in 6 months enough money to go backpacking to South America and
North
North
America.
America for 9 months, and living quite nicely. Yeah, so
Well done.
So that's a little bit of history for you there. So anyway, so essentially what they're saying is that obviously you've got to spend money on these ponds and these pumps and whatnot, but Australia's quite a hilly country, and the hills are nearby where we all are, living on the east coast. Like when you fly in an aeroplane and you're looking down, it's quite hilly, isn't it? You see lots of little hills and stuff. And so they worked out that the levelised cost of renewable electricity, where you built enough of those dams for that sort of hydro stuff, would be $93 per megawatt hour. So still under the cost of coal.
Not far under.
No, but given the benefits for our climate, pretty good.
What about the cost of sacrificing all that land to storage ponds?
Surprisingly, all that's incorporated as part of it. But a lot of this is kind of the way it was described in the report, and there's links to it, dear listener, go and read them, was these are areas that are not in national parks. They're not of any particular importance, and you're looking at a 1 hectare sort of pond at the top and a 1 hectare at the bottom and 25 metres deep, and basically there are maps showing typical scenarios in different locations that they found where and they've named the actual locations and they've done all the costings and that's what they've come up with. So for those who are watching on the if there are people, actually, I don't even know if there are people watching on the broadcast. I'm going to show it on the broadcast. So there's lots of places in Australia where it can go. The other thing that you would need to build is a new new high-powered transmission line, sort of a backbone running down through the country that allows the quick exchange of electricity over large distances. So that's also factored into the cost. But so the two main things are this storing of the power through these little dams and a better main backbone to distribute the electricity through the country. And what they said was that, according to the study they did, they looked at it on an hourly basis. There might have been minutes within those hours that they couldn't account for, but basically on an hourly basis they could. And they said, look, looking at the scenarios, there might be 1 or 2 times every 3 years where there's not enough power. And they said, because of weather predictions, the improved weather predicting, and it's going to come. And what you can say is to an aluminium smelter, for example, guys, we're going to have a problem in 2 days' time. You're going to have to shut down. And what they said was the extra cost involved in making the system big enough that you do not have to do that isn't justified, and you'd be better off just paying a compensation to that company and saying, for the 2 days that you don't have power every 3 years, here's a lump sum of money, because the actual cost of bumping the system up wasn't worth doing.
Except that in something like a metals smelter, my understanding is that you can't just shut them down and turn them back up again very easily.
That's why you have to pay compensation.
But even with compensation, I dare say you might chase some of those industries out of the country if they foresaw that might be the case.
If you're only closing down for 2 days every 3 years.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know, but my understanding is with some of those manufacturing, processing technologies, you need to keep it fired up.
But basically, they were saying to avoid that happening was going to cost an extra $2 billion per 5 years. So you can pay a lot of money as a compensation to avoid that. So when they arrive at their figure, which I said was $97, it allowed for that compensation.
It's all hypothetical anyway.
Yeah. So, and I've got a link to it.
It is theoretically possible to go 100% renewable then.
Indeed, according to this report, yeah. And
so I wonder if then to avoid having to pay out those compensations, whether or not you could have a gas-fired power station that's set on low all the time, and just on those couple of days you just got to fire it up.
Well, another mate of mine, fun fact, worked at a plant in Townsville, and this one's owned by Camalco or something like that. It runs on jet fuel, and when the wholesale price reaches a worthwhile level, he might be at home and he gets a text message that says, fire up the turbine.
Oh, really?
And he, on his mobile phone, using an app, starts the turbine up and then gets in his car and drives into the factory, and it's already warming up, and they get it going, and literally within an hour they're supplying the grid and earning bucket loads. And that facility sometimes earns in a matter of days all the money it needs for an entire year. Like when that wholesale price was just crazy, it was making unbelievable money. So you can have things like that sitting there for an emergency if you really wanted to as well, and accept the carbon emissions from, and that was running on like a jet fuel. So yeah. So there you go.
I wonder why jet fuel and not
Because it was just
gas.
so quick, and they could generate a lot of electricity
like very
quickly
rapidly,
and
yeah.
rapidly, and yeah. So
Interesting.
So there's another little graph that just shows how that would have panned out in this particular scenario, and you can see when the times are good, it pumps water up, and when they need the power, the water runs through. And I reckon that's a really ingenious way of doing things. So, yes, please, Scott. So there you go. There's lots of show notes there.
There is,
Click on it.
of course, an environmental cost for dams, and this is well known that wherever you build a dam, you lose habitat for something, for some kind of wildlife or
Yes, but when you're flying over the countryside, on your way down to Melbourne or Sydney, you're seeing lots of areas, and these are not in national parks that'll be suitable. So
you're still you're still inundating something.
yeah,
Yeah, but the thing was set up, Trevor was saying that you just set up 2 ponds that are only about a hectare each.
yes,
So you've got a pond up the top of the hill that's a hectare. You've got a pond down the bottom of the hill that's a hectare,
yep, and
joined by a pipe.
ideally about 700 metres at least in elevation between them. And
I doubt a hectare would be enough.
no, that's the sort of area
Really?
that they're talking about.
A hectare?
Yeah.
And would it be economical to build all the pipe works and the dynamos and everything just for a hectare of water?
That's the surface, and and then it's 25 metres deep. So yes.
Just a hectare. That's
Yeah.
not a big area.
No. Let me see if I can find the exact figure here. I'll come
I
back
think
to
it
it.
sounds
but
like a pretty good idea. There's obviously a fair bit of work to go through it and that
Quite
sort
a
of
lot
thing.
of work.
But you've had the first lot has been done, and it's been done by academics, and I think it's bloody good.
Well, while we're...
And then that bloke that came on the show that night that was talking to us about car batteries and all that sort of thing. He was saying that the car batteries, once they've been used in the car, can then go on and become a second life at your home. So he said they're no longer good for vehicles, but they're fine for home.
And people are installing batteries at
I
their
don't know,
homes,
but if they can get them cheaper for buying them off the used, if they're used and that sort of thing, then if you got battery storage at home, then you could have those couple of days where you got the problem with electricity. You could turn it off to the homes and then just have it going into the
Here we go.
industries.
Unlike conventional on-river hydropower, the off-river closed loop requires pairs of hectare-scale reservoirs, rather like oversized farm dams. Located away from rivers in steep hilly country outside national parks. So,
steep hilly country.
Yeah.
Steep hilly country is really only the east coast and the southeast coast of Australia. There's a little bit in the southwest. I mean, there are hills all over Australia, no doubt, but a lot of them are pretty shallow hills in the centre. You've driven through Western Queensland, haven't you?
but you don't need it in the west because the population is in...
All right, yeah.
Along
the east coast and in the southeast,
Yeah,
yeah.
exactly. So there we go. Anyway, I thought that was all very interesting, and that's the future that we should be looking at.
Did you see that story about people wanting to drain Lake Pedder? And do you have any thoughts on that?
What's Lake Pedder? I haven't
Lake
heard
Pedder was a exceptionally beautiful natural lake in the mountains in, I think, southwest Tasmania somewhere. And it had a really unique kind of white quartz beach all around the lake. And it was amazingly beautiful. People used to go camping there beside the lake. And you could even land a plane, a light plane on the beach beside the lake. And they dammed it. And the lake was flooded and lost underneath the raised level of the lake, of course.
Right.
But some environmentalists are saying, look, Tasmania has so many dams, more than enough, that it's okay to drain one of them and try to reclaim this lost, quite uniquely beautiful lake.
Right.
Yeah. You haven't seen that?
No.
I remember that story because I was told by a geography teacher that I had at school. And he said he went up there and he said it was absolutely breathtaking. But he said to get up there was so hard that he didn't think it was worth preserving because it was so hard to get there.
So it's only worth preserving if he could get there.
No, he just concluded that it wasn't worth preserving.
That it was in the wilderness where not many people would go, so why bother preserving it?
Exactly.
Yeah, I don't know. I think sometimes
See, this is the
nature's worth preserving just for its own sake, isn't it?
This is the whole point. Bob Brown started in the environmental movement opposing renewable energy. And he's also now turned up and he's opposed to that renewable energy thing with the windmills.
Yes, on one particular island.
Yeah, I know. I think he's going a little bit crackers in his old age. But, you just got to remember that he started his whole environmental crusade back in the 1980s when he was opposed to the Franklin River Dam, wasn't it? Yeah.
Yep.
Anyway.
I think the Lake Pedder Dam is roughly in the same area. I don't know whether Lake Pedder feeds into that same series of dams and lakes, but
I couldn't tell you.
It's in that area somewhere.
If you're in the chat room, I'm sorry because I haven't been able to look at the messages, but I'm going to try and do my best.
Did you see the message from Wazza?
No, what did he say? So, okay, Facebook chat is working but not Restream. Okay, it is now. I think I can see it now coming through. So,
Okay.
Sorry if you were making comments in there. Bronwyn said, Germany is in the process of phasing out both coal mining and coal-fired power generation. The government is putting a lot of investment into cold regions to develop new industries. And Warren says, in my view, energy supply currently can be either 1, affordable and reliable, or 2, reliable and low emissions, or 3, affordable and low emissions, not all 3. Well, have a look at that report, and see if it changes your mind, because it seems to indicate you can have all 3. There we go.
$93 a metric, $93 per kilowatt hour. Megawatt hour.
Yep.
It's cheaper than coal. Coal's $107 per megawatt hour. Well, that was for brown coal, but it was $100 a megawatt hour for black coal.
It was a bit
And
less than 100.
arguably, if it's 50% more than that, we should still do it, given the disaster that's ahead of us if we don't fix up our emissions.
You're preaching to the converted here. I agree with you. And, then if you had a very slight uptick in your power bill, you'd just be able to sit there and tell people to suck it up, because that's what you ought to be able to do to people.
Hey, Lionel Shriver was in the news.
What'd she do this time?
Well, she came out and said that...
She's a bit of a contrarian, isn't she?
Yeah. She was writing in The Spectator.
Yeah.
Which I'm very surprised you quoted from, Trevor.
Yeah.
But why?
Yeah.
Because Trevor doesn't like the Spectator.
Yeah, but I think I've warmed him to the Spectator. I'll take credit for that.
No.
I'll take credit for that.
So she said, as of 2017, worldwide carbon emissions, the US accounted for 13%, Canada 1.6%, Australia 1.1%, and the entire EU 9.6%. So the argument, basically the West is responsible for 26% of emissions. By contrast, China is responsible for 29.3%. And so she was saying, don't blame the West, because look at the figures. The West is not creating the problem.
You don't think she has a point?
No, because what's China doing? Making shit for the West.
Not only for the West.
But the West doesn't need to make. Yes, it is.
No, it isn't.
They're
building
manufacturing
bloody warships and planes.
What creates?
Oh, come
what
on,
creates carbon emissions?
Come on.
Manufacturing.
Now, this is a big myth
stuff.
that everything China creates is for Western consumption is absolutely a myth. The Chinese domestic consumption economy is big and getting bigger all the time. And eventually, like the West, they will be primarily geared up for domestic consumption. And they're getting closer all the time. And they're building lots of shit. You know, they're creating lots of stuff for Chinese people. It's not all for Western consumption by a long shot.
So, but you don't accept the argument that the developing countries are actually manufacturing, doing all the manufacturing for the developed countries, and that's why it's basically the pollution and carbon emissions are taking place in those developing countries because of stuff they're making for the West?
I think it's partially true, but I don't think it's convincingly all true at all, no.
Right, okay.
I've got a foot in both camps here because, you know, it says it right there. China's responsible for 29.3%.
It's a very large proportion.
Absolutely.
And that's just one country.
Now, I thought that America was the world's largest producer
Yeah, well,
of
that's what
carbon
everybody
dioxide,
wants us to think.
but it's only producing 13.7%, whereas China's producing 29.3%.
3 times as much.
Now, admittedly, China has a population that is 3 times the size of the United States.
And maybe that is one of the factors.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, that has got something to do with it, but I don't believe that we can completely wash our hands of getting the manufacturing done in the third world. But I also believe that Trevor's wrong too to blame them entirely for the carbon emissions, because
I'm not blaming them.
No, he's blaming us.
entirely. I'm just saying it's a disingenuous argument to say, oh, look at the current emissions. Oh, they're not coming from the West, they're coming from developing countries, so don't blame the West, is what Lionel Shriver is saying.
Yeah, well,
she's saying that. But
no, what she's saying really is that it has the load has to be borne by all countries, not just by the West.
Yeah, if you look at China getting 29.3% of the 29.3% of the carbon emissions, with a population 3 times that of the United States, if you had 3 times that, that'd end up at 42% or something like that of the world's carbon production. So they're lower on a per capita basis than what they are in the United States. I suspect the United States has got a very poor record if you go take it per capita.
But the United States is probably over the years becoming more efficient and doing things better, whereas the Chinese have been focused more on just cranking up production regardless of the environmental cost.
Absolutely, yeah.
Because you only got to visit any major Chinese city and you'll see what it's doing to the air.
Oh, God, yeah.
It's brown. The air is brown.
Yeah, I visited my brother a few years ago in Beijing and it was putrid.
It is.
The air was just repulsive.
It's really, really shocking. And, I don't know how people live there, frankly. And India is... in
India's
some
probably
respects
just as
worse.
bad.
Yeah, they say New Delhi has just about the worst air in the world. Jakarta is up there with the worst of them. Anyway.
Sorry, I'm distracted. I'm trying to see
Look,
these comments, guys.
Oh, we can talk between ourselves if you like.
I accept to some degree the argument that developing countries should be cut a little bit of slack. I do accept that argument. But China... I'm not convinced it's any longer a developing country.
I agree with
for
you.
goodness sake.
No, China is no longer a developing country. It's now a developed
Go to China
country.
and have a look, Trevor.
I've been to China.
It is an amazing,
I've been to China.
dynamic, country with lots and lots of high-tech stuff. They've got, high-speed trains. For goodness sake, they're building all kinds of stuff. They send spaceships to the moon.
What Lionel Shriver was saying was that population is the problem. That was her argument. So she was saying if you basically control population, then you've solved the problem. But the point is, are the people in the developing countries entitled to create a world like what we have here? So, for example, you might argue that, well, China's building all of these skyscrapers, lots of cement, lots of concrete, lots of stuff there. Yep,
Much more than you can imagine.
But to a large extent, the West has already built them. So they're just trying to catch up to a standard of living that we've already created, and we've deposited our emissions into the system. So again, it's disingenuous to say, well, we're not creating so much as these countries now, but that's because we already have done a lot of what we wanted to do, and these countries have got a long way to go. And if they're entitled to do the same things we did, then we've got a problem, even if the population remains stagnant. Because if you say that an African living in a mud hut can now have a concrete home or whatever, like if you're going to build cities for the developing world to catch up to the West, then we still have a problem. So just controlling the population is not enough.
I think China should be encouraged and perhaps subsidised in doing things cleanly, rather than... I mean, I certainly don't want to deny Chinese people or Africans or anybody the same standard of living that we have. I think everybody's entitled to a good standard of living. But I just think it has to be done smarter than just saying, sorry guys, but we're going to burn a lot of coal and we're going to do a lot of polluting until we catch up.
Like you did. So if the West says to the developing countries, hey, you guys can't do that, you're creating a mess. But the developing countries say to the West,
you already created a mess.
You did it. You've created your mess. You're happy to be sitting there now and telling us not to do it. But you're sitting pretty because you've already accomplished what you need to. We want to get to your position, and now you're saying we can't catch up.
Not saying
I think they should be allowed to catch up, but I agree with Paul. You've got to do it cleaner
and smarter.
Yeah,
cleaner and smarter.
Well, then
Why
the
not?
West needs to say to the developing countries, here. We need to cut a deal here because we've taken advantage of this, and now we're telling you can't.
Yeah, I agree with you there.
Maybe some kind of technology transfer or something like that.
Yeah.
Absolutely, everybody on the planet is entitled to a decent standard of living.
Yeah.
I don't have an argument with that at all.
Well, I just think Lionel Shriver was disingenuous where she was saying, look, all the emissions are coming from the developing world, and basically if you stop this population explosion, then it'll all be fine. Was kind of what she was saying, and stop talking about other things because it's the population is everything. But if you take the view that the existing population is living in pretty decrepit conditions and there'd be a lot of emissions involved in bringing them up to a Western standard, then just simply stopping population growth isn't enough.
No, I just think it could be done smarter.
All right.
Are you going to burn her books now?
No, but it's interesting because Lionel Shriver and Martin Iles of the ACL have a lot in common.
Really?
Because the right wing on issues...
Oh, come on, here we go. Left wing, right wing.
Yeah.
You think she's right wing just because she makes a statement like that?
I think she is more than I thought she was before. But it just goes to show that we were very fond of her because of her freedom of speech and cultural appropriation.
Yes, she's
issues.
a free thinker.
Yes.
And she's a good writer too, according to you.
And she is. And don't we often find that the free speech proponents come from the right? And Martin Iles...
And the centre, please. Yeah, and the centre.
And Martin Iles of the ACL, I'll call him right-wing as well, he was very big and correct on freedom of speech, I have to say.
And good for him
and
on that
this
point.
Is our problem, I think, we find, is that, I find, I'll speak for myself, is that the left has abandoned this whole freedom of speech thing.
Sadly, they seem to have done
that.
But I don't see free speech as a right-wing issue at all.
It shouldn't be, but it tends to fall that way more often than not.
Think about the left wing 50 years ago. They were all out on the streets demanding free speech.
Right.
It was a left-wing issue.
Yes.
It really was.
Yes.
You know, in the 20th century, except in the countries that had socialist governments, because they were all under totalitarianism and couldn't say whatever what they liked. But free speech has traditionally been a left-wing issue because, I mean, you know, what about the French Revolution? That was a left-wing movement, and free speech was part of their success. But the 21st century left wing, they've lost the plot as far as I'm concerned on a lot of things.
Yeah.
And free speech is definitely one of them.
Yeah. So anyway,
But I don't consider myself right wing. And I'm very strong on free speech, as you know.
I know. But the more we learn about each other, the more. Well,
Do you think we're losing Trevor, Scott?
Trevor's
we're
been
to-
lost for
To the
so
dark
long.
side?
well, let's see how right wing. Let's see how right wing you are, Paul.
Oh, come on.
Donald Trump, Turkey, Kurds.
Donald Trump's a disgrace.
Would you just? Does anybody want to summarise what's happened with Trump? And
Donald Trump has tweeted over the weekend that he is withdrawing the United States troops from northeastern Syria, or the allegedly autonomous Kurdish region in northeast Syria. Turkey announced after that they're going to invade to take out the Kurds.
Well, they want to create a 30-kilometre buffer zone, I think,
Yeah.
between the Turkish border.
Yeah.
and they want to wipe out some Kurds.
And they want to kill some Kurds.
They want to kill some Kurds because they've got a problem with the YPG at home, blah, 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 blah. Anyway, this is what Donald Trump has got himself into trouble for because he said he's going to withdraw the troops. Now, he's done this basically unilaterally, and he's got a hell of a lot of flack from his own side over this. But he doesn't give a shit because he's actually just said, he says, no, I was elected to pull us out of these useless wars, so I'm going to do that.
And he went to the election saying, "I'm going to pull American troops out of these
Yeah, and he
Middle
probably
Eastern
did say that.
conflicts."
But he makes it up as he goes along because at any given point he can have a different position and say, this is what I was elected to do, you know? I mean, he didn't pull them out immediately after he was elected, did he?
So the poor Kurds. I was reading an article which basically described how through the years the Kurds have been screwed over numerous times, where by the Americans who have promised them the world,
By the British, by the Americans,
if they
by
will
everyone.
assist, because invariably they've been a minority force in a country, and if at the time that country is in favour with the Americans, then they'll squash the Kurds. But if it's a country which is out of favour, they'll prop up the Kurds in order to topple that out of favour government.
And they've also been suppressed by whatever, you know, local ethnic group controlled the government or the politics of the country.
Yes, because they've always been a minority.
But they've been a minority across several different countries: Iran, Syria, Iraq, and parts of eastern Turkey.
But in this whole fight against ISIL,
Yeah.
could America have had a better friend than the Kurds?
No.
Could the Kurds have done anything more to have exhibited loyalty and to the cause and to have done
And
more?
sacrifice.
And
A
sacrifice.
lot of them were killed
Yeah.
in the fighting against ISIS,
And the
including
Americans,
women battalions.
and the Americans dropped them like a school
Brigades.
case. And what's America going to do if we are like the Kurds and we're just a bit inconvenient at the time, despite anything that we might have done?
We're going to
We'll
get dropped
be-
like a school
They're
case.
going to drop us like a school
Southern
case as
Hemisphere
well.
Kurds.
It just goes to show.
Oh, I know.
It doesn't matter. It just is what is in their benefit at the time.
Fortunately, Donald Trump
and
is a temporary aberration.
Well, you know Trump's problem. Well, actually, here's an interesting thing, just before I forget.
I don't think he is temporary. I think there's
No,
a
he's
possibility
not,
he could
he's not
win.
an aberration. He is just...
He can
been-
only be president for a maximum of 8 years.
Yeah, I
but,
know that.
But the one who will be after him will be worse because the
do you know?
system created Donald Trump. The system created... He's not an aberration. I mean, people thought, let's get rid of George W. Bush because the next one's got to be better. Like, people will be saying, I think Cam Riley said this, let's get rid of Trump because the next one's bound to be better. And at some point we're going to be saying, remember the good old days of Donald Trump when things weren't so bad? Like, the system has led us to this. So...
So do you think it's the electoral system or what?
It's about
Partly,
power.
yes.
It's about power and the corruption of the political system.
And money has corrupted the American system in a very, very major way.
Absolutely. I mean, Trump could do anything and get away with anything except to interfere with the industrial military complex. At that point,
They would take him out.
the Republicans and McConnell and all of them said, "What? Go and shoot someone down Fifth Avenue. We can handle that. But if you're going to actually pull out of conflicts in the Middle East, that's not on. Like that will be
Beyond
a
the
reason
pale.
where they'll drop him and say, "Oh, have your impeachment inquiry. Let's get rid of him, and we'll get Mitch in, and we'll get Pence in, and it'll all be sweet because you can do anything but not muck around with the military-industrial complex." So the interesting thing was when
So you think this is going to be his last act, do you?
he'll fold, he'll cave into what they want. He'll reverse, this.
The Turks are just about already crossing the border. They're not going to wait.
Yeah.
Well, I don't think the Turks will actually roll against the Americans.
No, the Americans are already pulling out
Yeah,
in
they're already
some
pulling
areas.
out, yeah. So, good luck to the Kurds. When Turkey said, we're going to go in and kill them, the tweet from Donald Trump was, "If Turkey does anything like that, I, in my great and unmatched wisdom, consider to be off limits. I will totally destroy and obliterate the economy of Turkey. I've done before." This is the president of the United
deluded,
States,
isn't
of the
he?
most powerful military operation in the world, saying, in my great and unmatched wisdom,
Great and unmatched
I will totally destroy and obliterate the economy of Turkey.
The man's mad, isn't
He is. He's.
Closer to the microphone,
I think
please.
he's very
Sorry.
close to certifiable when he says things like that, isn't he? Great and unmatched wisdom. That is delusion at certifiable insane levels. I think.
it's like on the... What's the podcast I listen to? Cognitive Dissonance. They've often saying, well, China has a great deal of respect for my great enormous a brain, which is what... which is what Donald Trump said once. It's just
I think
madness.
the Chinese leadership are laughing over their drinks at Donald Trump, don't you think?
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
not completely laughing at what he's done to the Chinese economy, but I don't think any of them think he's a great and wise leader at all. He's so impulsive, like a teenager. He makes it up as he goes along.
Well, they've been probably predicting the demise of the American empire, and they just look at Donald Trump and double down on their plans.
Yeah.
I would think that's what I would be doing if I was them. So
Well, see, if the Yanks do actually drop the Kurds, then I think Morrison's should be well advised to go over to Washington and sit him down and say, Donald, that joint military exercise that we've got going on in Pine Gap? It's going to be an Australian military exercise before too long. We want you out.
he's not going to do that.
I know he's not going to do
not
that.
gonna
But
do
then,
that.
but then what he should do is on his way back to Australia, he should drop into Beijing and say, "G'day, Uncle Shi, how are you?"
Oh, come on.
See, here's what should happen, because we've been saying Americans are meddling in other countries all the time. And listening to this, you'd be thinking, well, what do you want us to keep meddling in another country? Like, he's actually offering to pull out of a country. The problem is he's abandoning an ally. So really what they should be doing is throwing their hands up, the Americans, and saying, we created a complete mess here, and we're not good guys to have around because we just fuck everything up. The United Nations peacekeeping force should go in there, and here's a bunch of money, and sorry, and we'll just go
What do
away.
they ever do?
So, well,
They don't do a lot of shooting, do they? The United Nations peacekeepers.
Yeah, but that's the whole point. You've just got to have a neutral force between the two combatants.
It didn't do much. They didn't do much good in Srebrenica, did they?
Yeah, I know. Srebrenica was a...
They didn't do much good in the East African country that
Rwanda.
Rwanda.
Yep.
Yeah.
They had peacekeepers there.
Yep.
They didn't do shit.
Have they done any good anywhere?
Good question.
I don't know enough. But
Well,
that's
the
what my
United
thoughts-
Nations, the
that's what my
United
thoughts
Nations
are.
Army
East Timor.
Is we actually want the Americans to get out of the Middle East, but we don't want to leave the Kurds in the lurch. So there should be some sort of
No, the Kurds deserve a break.
a properly operating UN peacekeeping force would be good.
And, a UN peace enforcing force, I think, would be even better, where they actually give them the option to actually pull the bloody trigger rather than just stand there and watch it happen.
I think more like the African, the
African
Union of African countries. They have an African sort of intervention force of some sort. And I think they actually use their guns when necessary.
So does any of this change your
for those big expensive subs? We should have bought 50 cheap Japanese subs and armed them with nuclear-tipped missiles. There you go.
No, I don't think we should have armed them with missiles. I just think, I honestly believe that Jesus Christ, you can throw rocks at me for saying this if you like, but
Got them ready.
yeah, I honestly believe it is probably time for us to say to the Americans, you have burned one too many allies now, and we are not going to allow ourselves to be the next one burned.
We just have to prepare ourselves to defend ourselves by ourselves.
Absolutely.
Indeed. And rather than, by siding with the Americans all the time, we're actually making ourselves a bigger target with people like the Chinese. If we were to defend ourselves and seek cooperation in our region and sort of detach ourselves from the Americans, we'd actually be safer.
We'd be detaching ourselves from the largest liberal democracy in the world, which would be a big mistake.
I know it's a liberal democracy.
And that's important. It is important.
It is important, but you can't ignore the fact that they have just cut one of their allies adrift.
Well, they look like they're about to. I agree with that. That's shocking. I wouldn't drop our friendship with the Americans over that.
No, I would.
But I would.
And you were saying earlier, not so right wing, but it's sort of exhibit A to my.
No, it isn't.
Yeah.
But I would seriously counsel the Americans that they are doing something really, really wrong.
Actually, in the chat room, Karen says that Rwanda completely ignoring West Papua and the UN is a bit useless and we can't defend ourselves.
Yeah, the UN didn't do shit in West Papua.
So, Karen, I'm just interested. Do you think the US should pull out of leave the Kurds alone and leave them defend themselves, or what do you think should happen there? But when we talk about we cannot defend ourselves, go back to an earlier episode where I had Han 2 on, and Australia can defend itself. Like, if we've got half a dozen half-decent submarines, we can defend ourselves from a Chinese invasion right now because it's extremely difficult to cross an ocean with a bunch of troop ships, and if you've got good submarines and good air force, you can stop a large nation. It's tough and difficult. So
it is.
It's easier than you would think for Australia to defend itself. Now, of course,
even
the
Normandy landings were very, very high risk at that time.
Yeah.
And they weren't at all sure that they wouldn't suffer enormous losses.
Indeed. So so go back to that episode, dear listeners, and check out my conversation with Han 2 about how, the ocean makes a big difference. And if you were in charge of a Chinese troop ship trying to come here or a destroyer or anything, and knowing there's submarines around, you would be worried about your chances of making it.
Yeah.
So,
well, they'd have to get past Japan and South Korea first to come down here, wouldn't they?
Oh, Japan's not really on the way. It's way up
further
in Northeast Asia.
Yeah, good point.
But
we should have, I agree with you, we should have bought more cheaper Japanese subs.
Yes. And go back
20
to
of them, 30 of them.
Google me how the current purchase is a complete nonsense. And anyway.
The whole thing was designed to buy off South Australia because they'd lost the car industry. But the amount of money we are wasting on those submarines, we could have subsidised our car industry for decades.
And they probably won't be delivered until 2030 or something ridiculous.
And it was just an ambit claim by the Defence Force where they went, look, we probably need 3 subs. Let's ask for 12 and then we'll negotiate our way down to 3. And they asked for 12 and bloody...
Turnbull, was it?
No, Abbott said, sure, you can have them all. And they probably fell off their chairs and went, oh, shite. Now we've got to find guys to actually fill them. That's going to be difficult. So, long story on submarines. We'll revisit that at another time. But when we're talking about America and my distrust of them and how we need to disengage from them to actually make ourselves safer. And you and Hugh Harris sort of accuse me of being some sort of Noam Chomsky sort of like character on this,
And you're not?
on this sort of issue.
And I agree with them on that. Yeah.
Yep. So I would like to refer to an article by John Menadue.
He's
So
one
we
of your favourites.
quite often quote the John Menadue blog.
Yeah.
Who the hell is John Menadue? Bit of background, dear listener. From 1960 to 67, he was private secretary to Gough Whitlam, leader of the opposition. He then moved into the private sector for 7 years as general manager News Limited Sydney, publisher of The Australian. He was head of Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet from 74 to 76. He was Australian ambassador to Japan, 76 to 80. He returned to Australia in 1980, took up position head of Department of Immigration and Ethnic Affairs, appointed to head of Department of Trade in December 1983. Chief Executive Officer of Qantas, 86 to 89, Director of Telstra from 94 to 96, Chairman of the Australia-Japan Foundation, 91 to 98.
How do you fit all that in?
I reckon
in
that's a
one
pretty
lifetime?
fair resume of somebody who knows something of how politics and the world works, particularly in the Asian region, and has you wouldn't call that, you know, when you've been editor of the Australian, what did we say he was, or
Sorry,
general manager of News
the
Limited.
Australian's too right wing. We'll have to
We can hardly
give him a black mark for that one.
we can hardly call him some lefty Trotsky sort of Chomskyite.
Secretary
Yeah.
to Gough Whitlam.
Can we? Like, seriously?
But
Secretary
that
to
was
Gough
between
Whitlam.
1960. That was after 1967. He moved in there and became general manager of News Limited.
Yeah.
That was back when the Australian was actually a decent newspaper.
True.
You know, that was back
It
when
hadn't
you,
got
when
as
you-
bad as it...
No,
Indeed.
it hadn't got anywhere near as bad as
I'll
what
give
it
you
is
that.
now.
But can I give you a resume of somebody like that as being somebody that we can at least say, well,
Yeah,
sounds
absolutely.
like
Definitely.
a balanced
Definitely
resume.
take him
Absolutely,
seriously.
yes, yes.
Definitely
Absolutely.
take him seriously.
Yeah.
What does he think about this whole US
Is
relationship?
he still alive?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. He runs the John Menadue blog. People contribute to it with their
I
articles.
assumed that he just put his name on it and then sort of.
No. So
Died.
He curates
Well,
it and helps
you know,
manage
with a
it.
career like that, he must be getting on in years.
Yeah.
He's a fair age now. I couldn't tell you how old, but he's
Yeah.
a fair age.
So he'd have to be.
Okay, what does he say about these issues, right?
Shall we call him?
Well, he's written an article telling us. I'm going to quote some of it.
Good.
The US is the greatest threat to peace in the world. It is an aggressor across the globe. It is the most violent country both at home and abroad. Apart from brief isolationist periods, the US has been almost perpetually at war, wars that we have been foolishly drawn into. The US has subverted and overthrown numerous governments over 2 centuries. It has a military and business complex, a hidden state that depends on war for influence and enrichment. And fortunately, many of our political, bureaucratic, business and media elites find it hard to think of a world without an American focus. We had a similar and dependent view on the UK in the past, and that ended in tears in Singapore. Good example. I mean, how close were we? And we said, help, we need to... Singapore, and then us, like, in the UK just dropped us like a suitcase.
Well, they were absolutely incapable of helping us at that time.
Yeah, I think that
They wouldn't even send our own troops back.
Yeah, and that was
so
a very big.
They
problem.
could have done that.
That was a very big problem.
They
that
didn't
Church-
get a choice
Let
in the
me-
end
let-
because our Prime Minister
well, then
just
the
called
US
them
is
back.
going to say, oh, we can't do that because of other problems. So sorry. We're busy over here.
And they might.
Yeah. The US has launched 201 out of 248 armed conflicts since World War II. In recent decades, most of these wars have been unsuccessful. They've got 700 military bases around the world. US fleets patrol in strength off the Chinese coast. The US would have mass hysteria if the Chinese fleets patrolled off the Californian coast or the Florida Keys.
I'd be
as
very
it's
surprised if
legally
they
entitled
don't.
to do.
No, they do.
They don't.
Oh, I'd be very surprised if they don't have any ships.
They don't parade up and down the coast
Maybe
like
not
the
parade,
Americans do.
but they'll visit like they visit us occasionally.
The US has been meddling in other countries' affairs and elections for a century. Blah, blah, blah. Our long-term future depends on cooperation in our region and not reliance on a dangerous and distant ally. How long will Australian denial of US policies continue? When will some of us stand up? When will our humiliation end? insofar as China is any sort of distant threat, it would be much less so if we were not so subservient to the US. The US is determined to make China its enemy. We are cooperating in that process. The US is a very dangerous ally. It is more likely to get us into trouble than out of trouble. We are joined at the hip with the most violent and dangerous country in the world. There we go.
I think it's
John.
partially true, but I think he completely ignores other dangerous countries that exist. He's got a strong anti-American bias, I think.
Well,
Maybe
I
that's
think
why.
he's presenting evidence, though.
Well, he has given one-sided evidence. He hasn't said why America's gone to war in all those occasions, and in some cases, I think war was justified. You don't think the Americans should have got involved in the First or Second World Wars?
I was
Yeah,
quoting
but these
figures
were
post Second World War.
Wars. These are wars.
All of those?
Yeah.
Ones I was. Do you want me to go back to the quotes? The US has launched 201 out of 248 armed conflicts since the end of World War II.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Been busy.
At least they've been consistent.
Yeah, I got criticised for saying I honestly believe, but I've got no other option except to say I honestly believe, is that the Yanks were probably the last war they're actually justified in 100% was probably the Korean conflict.
Oh, don't.
You
Yes,
don't
say
they
that.
were
You
justified.
don't think they were
in it.
justified in entering the Korean conflict to protect the South Koreans from invasion?
No.
Oh, for God's sake.
Trevor,
you
really?
can't be
Seriously?
serious.
Next week, Korean War.
Okay.
Next week. Can we just have your statement of faith here before next week? That the
So-
Americans were entirely justified in entering the Korean War.
Okay.
Is that what we've got?
I think Trevor's going to tell us
Is that what we've got?
the South Koreans started it, not the North Koreans.
The North Koreans invaded the South. You know,
And the Americans were entirely justified in getting involved.
I don't think they had any choice but to get involved.
If you look
Sorry, just tell me why, just so I can prepare for
if
next
you look
week.
at what
just tell me why.
North Korea is like now, that would have been the whole Korean peninsula.
Just tell me.
No.
Because the North Koreans invaded the South, and the South was left with no option but to fight back, and they didn't have any forces of their own. The only
The North Koreans were supplied by the Russians
and the Chinese. The only reason the Yanks actually got involved is because they had a military garrison in Japan. They sent them over there initially, and then they backed them all up with conscripts and all that sort of thing with conscripts from around the world. And it was a multinational force that was led by the Americans, but it was sent in,
And there were a
pushed
lot
them
of
back.
countries involved.
Absolutely, there were a
I've
hell of a
been
lot
to
of
the
countries
war
involved.
cemetery in southern South Korea, and there's a lot of different countries represented there.
So in every civil war around the world, America should get involved?
No, not a
saying
civil
that.
war. There's
So
not a that was not a civil war. You had two separate countries that were divided along the 38th parallel by agreement. The North reneged on the agreement and invaded the South. The South had no choice but to help and to put up their hands and say, "We need help." The Yanks came in and they pushed them back. Now, where it fucked up, and pardon the language, ladies and
Do you
gentlemen,
see
but
on the screen the
French
do you see
again.
the waving finger on the screen?
yeah, where it fucked up was when after the Panmunjom, was that the successful landing of the Americans?
No, it was Incheon.
Incheon.
Yeah, near Seoul.
Yeah,
Just west
that
of
was
Seoul.
just after that, when the push drove them right up to the north, was that what MacArthur should have done was he should have got onto. Was it Eisenhower was the president then or not?
I don't recall.
No, it was still Johnson. No, not Johnson. Anyway, whoever the president
so
was,
basically,
he should
because
have
of an
said
aggressive North, the Americans were in a civil war. Just because of an aggressive North, the Americans were entitled to be there.
absolutely.
So anytime any country has an aggressor fighting, like the Americans can go in, is that what we're at? Like anytime there's a conflict around the world?
You were setting me up for some sort of failure, but I honestly...
Like what made this one so special that America should be there, that perhaps they shouldn't be in some other civil war going on in Africa or something.
Because
these
civil wars are actually defined as a war that happens inside of borders.
Right.
You had two separate countries. One country was the aggressor, the other country was the victim.
Look, it was only a few years after the end of the Second World War, and as we know, the Communist Party of North Korea was the aggressor. It wasn't all the North Korean people. It was the Communist Party, the Korean Workers' Party.
Okay, and the South was completely innocent.
No, it was a dictatorship. But at least it was a dictatorship of people who were, had a relative degree of
Americans
freedom.
supported a dictatorship. And
It was a military dictatorship.
Right.
But
and
which
who was installed as the military commander? Who was the commander?
Which developed into a modern, flourishing, dynamic, prosperous liberal democracy. What happened to North Korea? Did it develop into a prosperous, modern, liberal democracy?
No.
It developed into one of the most tyrannical, totalitarian regimes in the world. So thanks, Americans, for not leaving us with the whole peninsula like that.
Exactly. Had the Americans not got involved, the entire peninsula
would have been
taken over.
Absolutely.
Thank goodness for the Americans.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Okay, next week.
And thank you, America, for your sacrifice.
Thank you for your service. Next week,
They lost a lot of people in
next
that
week,
conflict.
Korea.
Yeah, and they lost a lot of people because MacArthur should have gone to the president and he should have said
Next week, Korea.
He should have sent the
Have we
president.
run out of time already?
No,
He should have sent the
No,
president.
because I
over
want to
to
do proper. Like you throw these topics in like this, and rather than just shooting off the top of their heads,
Okay, we
I
should
would
do
like
a
to do a
bit
proper
of research.
No worries, that's fine.
research and a proper analysis, and phone a friend and do that.
You're
So-
not going to get Cam Worley on the programming again, are you?
Well, I'll have to put him on the time limit, perhaps.
Can we call Hugh?
Yeah, you can. Hey, anybody realise we just did a prisoner swap, by the way?
Yeah, we did do a prisoner
did,
swap
yes.
with Iran. Yeah.
With the Iranians, yeah.
How many Australians would know that we just did a prisoner swap?
Well,
Quite a few, actually, because it was on the ABC website.
Well,
and
no,
it
well,
wasn't
so
stated,
100,000
it wasn't stated
people.
explicitly that it was a prisoner swap, but the Australian Foreign Affairs Department spokesperson, maybe the foreign minister herself, was asked, was it a prisoner swap? And they just said, we do not comment on sensitive matters like this, which is another way of saying, of course it was a prisoner swap.
We can't say.
But we just don't want to say that
Yeah.
publicly.
So a couple of backpackers who were caught up in Iran, flying a drone, were locked away for a while, and Iran said, hey, you got this guy locked up in Australia, and we'd like him back, please. So
They
prisoner
weren't
swap.
quite backpackers, of course. They were travelling by car and having a great old time.
Yeah. So, right. Where are we up to? I reckon that's probably.
You think that's enough?
That's
Enough
I think.
left-wing,
I think we've covered a good range of
right-wing
topics there. I think.
discussion. Yeah.
Did you have any, Scott, that you were keen to go through, or we
No.
can leave all till next week?
we
or-
can leave them all till next week. There's a few here that have been carried over a few times.
Yeah,
so
we
should
got a
probably deal
fair
with
bit.
them.
We always have a surplus of material, don't we?
We do. Indeed.
We do, because the religious nutters never go quiet, do they?
No, they don't.
Yeah.
In fact, they've become very, very active in recent years, and we have to do something about it.
Yeah. Actually,
And just before we
yeah, go
sorry.
ahead. No,
Well, I was just going to say thank you very much to Tony, because tonight I've had a Little Creatures Rogers beer,
Yes.
which is very nice.
Thanks, Tony.
yes.
While we're talking about beer sponsors, thanks very much to Woz, Wayne, Landon, Hardbottom, Bronwyn, Dave, Adam, Caitlin, Zach, Captain Doomsday, friend of the show, Anne, and Tony.
Thank you indeed, dear listener. We have patrons for this podcast. Got a new patron.
Are they left-wing
Camille.
patrons or right-wing patrons, do you think?
Do you know they're a bit of both? And Camille came on board as a patron with a very generous donation, and just said hello via email. And she said she enjoys the podcast and mentioned that our Indigenous episode was one that she found quite challenging, and she still doesn't know what to actually make of it all, but enjoyed the challenging ideas that were in that. So
That's what we're
I-
about.
Yes, I like that. I like it when people. We went through a spate there where people, when they used to give feedback, said, enjoying the podcast. Don't always agree with you, but enjoy your considered opinions. And
I think that's a very, very good sign.
it is
myself.
Yeah, it
I
is.
hope we
It's
get
quite a
more people
compliment
like that.
when we get that. So sort of Camille was a bit along those lines as well. So
We
that's
don't.
good.
We don't really want an echo chamber on this podcast, do we?
No,
No,
so,
we don't want an echo chamber at all.
And even
Otherwise, then if we had to have him agreeing with us all the time, we'd be screwed.
and and of course, 12th man is the resident contrarian. You really get people screwed up, but
Do I?
Yes, but
Well done, 12th man. Well done to me.
that's right. And if you're out there and you're finding that frustrating, then just work with me as I enjoy the challenge and try and rebut the outrageous ideas that he comes out with, and just follow me as I work my way through it. So yes, we have patrons who donate. All we ask is $1 a show.
Cheap.
Have you been with us since Morrison got elected? In which case, that's about 20 to 25 episodes ago. And if you've been listening religiously ever since, then you're not a patron, then it's time to stump up, because if you're listening every week and you're enjoying it, then we expect you to become a patron, and it helps to cover some costs, and we'll do some extra bits and pieces as we get more money. And if you are enjoying it and you're not prepared to pay that $1 a show, then what I'd like you to do is reach for your podcast app right now and find us there and hit the unsubscribe or delete button. And goodbye. We'll see you in a year's time. You can come back and see if you like us or not then. But that's the whole idea of it, dear listener. So
You can listen to it for free if you log on to the Secular Party Facebook page.
right. Well, no, it'll still hook into this. Well, you can always listen to it for free. That's
Of course
the point.
they can, yeah.
But I want you to feel guilty if you
just
do.
being
That's what
cheeky.
I want to do. So thank you to the patrons. Sean, Janelle, Craig, John, Landon, Wayne, Oyama, Alison, Steve, Tony, Caitlin, Watley, Jimmy Spud, Kane, Bronwyn, Matt J, Robert, Rod, Palais, Maddock Man, Dominic, Liam, Dave, Karen, Daniel, Harry, Peter, Captain Doomsday, Aidan, Wheat Watcher, Andy, Murray, Melinda, Adam, Greg, Professor Dr. Dentist, Will, Glenn, Craig, Matthew, Clinton, Alexander, Paul, Tom, Tero and Camille, and the non-patrons, Dean, Ken, Was, the beneficiary, Mr. Anderson, Corinne, Matt Mann, David and Beverly. Thank you very much. It is appreciated, and I'm still toying with the idea of a little call-in section at the end of these podcasts.
What section?
A call-in, where people could phone in. And,
okay.
But it will require a little bit of technology, and so if we get a few more patrons, I'll do it, and we'll give it a go. It's dangerous because who knows what crazy people could ring in, but it might be one of those things that it doesn't actually make it onto the actual recorded podcast unless it's really high quality. But anyway, it's worth playing around with, and some people could
You never
chip
know.
in with interesting ideas.
Landon
I think.
Hardbottom might call us.
Indeed. So
Yeah.
if you like the idea of us introducing a sort of a phone-in segment at the end, which would be duly edited for the podcast, become a patron, and we get a couple more, and then I'll introduce that and see what happens, because I'm enjoying the feedback in the chat room, and it annoyed me that I lost contact with the chat room earlier and I couldn't see what people were saying. So if you were saying things and we didn't talk about your comments because it wasn't quite working correctly till halfway through. So that's good. If you've got feedback, if you've come across an interesting article, read a book, you've got an interesting idea, think we're completely nuts about something, send us a message.
Just let Trevor know how wrong he is over not backing the Americans in South Korea.
Do you know, I'm reading a book about postmodernism,
Yes.
and I've only read bits and pieces of it. You know, I sort of flipped through it, and today I was flipping through it, and I came across a chart on one page, and it was comparing numbers of deaths in the millions under capitalism and socialism.
Oh, really?
Really?
Yeah.
And what was it?
It was
how's
vastly different to your calculation, but
but it was actually a capitalism, socialism.
oh yeah, and I was intrigued. I don't know how he calculated the numbers exactly.
You didn't break it down much?
Look, I'll bring it in and show you.
Yeah, I'd be interested in that. That was one of their better episodes, Death by
It
Capitalism.
was interesting, yeah. It was interesting.
I enjoyed that one.
Yeah. But anyway, I'll bring it in and show you next week.
Right. I hope you enjoyed that, dear listener. We had fun, as always.
Absolutely, yeah.
Well, charging on, we just keep rolling through. We will be back to the normal time next week, which is Tuesday at 7:30 Brisbane time.
8:30 New South Wales and
Yes.
Victorian time and Tasmanian time.
As the saying goes, we are 1 hour and 20 years behind the rest of Australia for the next.
We'll give
few
those
months.
Southerners time to have a few more drinks before they listen to the podcast.
That's it. Yeah. So bear with the time differences. So good on you out there. Thank you very much. Talk to you next time. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for tuning in. Bye now.
See ya.